Hello, I'm Jim Turk, the Director of the Center for Free Expression. I'd like to welcome you to today's In Conversation series. Today, we're going to be looking at the alarming explosion of exposures that Canadians are facing to toxic substances and toxic chemicals, and our government's unwillingness to allow us to be informed properly of those dangers. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that the territory in which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for today's event, which is Eco Justice and Environmental Defense. We are appreciative of both of their co-sponsorships. Our featured guest today is Bruce Lanphear. Bruce was in the news, you may have seen several months ago, when he resigned as the co-chair of the Health Canada Scientific Advisory Committee on Pest Control Products, over his concerns about the lack of transparency and scientific oversight. He's one of Canada's leading authorities on environmental health. He's a professor of health sciences at Simon Fraser University, and he has served on numerous scientific advisory committees, not only at Health Canada here in Canada, but also at the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the Centers for Disease Control, and the American Academy of Pediatrics. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
In conversation with Bruce will be Sandra Bartlett. Sandra is an award-winning journalist. She's worked as a reporter, a documentary producer, and a foreign correspondent at CBC and at NPR in the United States. Her stories have appeared in many media, including PBS Frontline, ProPublica, Swiss TV. I won't continue on the very long list. We're delighted to have you with us today, Sandra. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, the format for today's event is going to be a conversation between Bruce and Sandra, and that will go on for about 45 minutes or so. And at that point, Sandra will then turn to the audience to deal with any questions that you may have. In this version of Zoom that we're using, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, which allows you to write out a question anytime one comes to mind. And then when we get to that point where Sandra and Bruce turn to the audience, Ange Holmes, who's the center's coordinator, will read out the first question that's come in, and then Bruce will be able to address it. And we'll do that for the last half hour or so of today's event. So please don't wait for your questions until we turn to the audience. If, as you're listening to Sandra and Bruce talk, if a question comes to mind, just click on the Q&A button, write your question out, so it'll be ready when we are able to turn to the audience. I think that's it for me. Over to the two of you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have a lot of bad stuff to talk about today. So I thought like we might start off with, you spent a lot of your career studying lead and its impact on people, but lead's been taken out of gasoline. It's no longer in paint. It's not in children's toys. So is the risk from lead gone?
No, it's not gone. It's come down quite a bit, particularly in Canada and some other more affluent countries, but it's still a problem worldwide. And even still today, even though levels have come down by over 90%. So first of all, lead production is at an all-time high because the demand for leaded car batteries is so high around the world. So production has continued to climb. It's plummeted over the last 3 decades, but even today in a Canadian birth cohort, we call it MIREC, we can find evidence down to the lowest levels of ongoing risk. So for example, a 10 part per billion increase in lead in pregnant women was associated with about a 50% increase in giving birth prematurely. 10 parts per billion, just even today, most people think of that as so small it means nothing. In that same cohort study, we found that that same 10 part per billion increase in blood lead in women who were vitamin D deficient led to an over twofold increased risk in preterm birth. So even at these low levels, we see evidence of harm, whether it's preterm birth or preeclampsia. But equally striking is when we banned leaded gasoline in Canada and the United States and then Europe, what happened was the companies started to sell their product to industrializing countries or low to middle income countries. So today, about 1 out of 3 children are lead poisoned around the world. 1 out of 3 children. 90% of those children live in low to middle income countries. Just this last month, the World Bank released a report looking at what we call the global burden of disease from lead. Global burden of disease in its simplest form is how many people die every year from lead. They estimated 5.5 million people die every year from lead-induced cardiovascular disease. 5.5 million. At a cost, when you combine that with the deficits in children's learning abilities, of $6 trillion a year, which is equivalent to 7% of global GDP. So the size of this is still enormous, even as we've seen levels of exposure come down.
It's, we're going to talk about regulation, of course, as well today, but this whole idea that it gets regulated here and then it just gets shipped over someplace else, that happens with a lot of the chemicals. And, after the Second World War, a lot of things were developed during the war, and we entered a period of time which was called better living through chemistry. And all kinds of products were produced, and our lives were made easier. And there's one man-made chemical that we've only recently learned a lot about. Well, maybe the past 10 years. It's dangerous to our health, but also the dangers to our planet. And it's what I would call the PFAS family of chemicals. Now, they were quite miraculous when they came along. Teflon prevented cooks from burning dinner. Stain-resistant coatings prevented kids from ruining furniture. It's on firefighting gear as well. But now they're in absolutely everything. Pizza boxes, food wrappers, cosmetics, dental floss, the list goes on and on. What are they, and how did we get here?
Well, as you pointed out, there was DuPont, in fact, came up with that slogan, better living through chemistry, after they were spotlighted in a book called Merchants of Death. And they were spotlighted because they had produced so many products that kill people. And so this was a way for them to try to polish their image. But it worked amazingly well, and they continued to use that better living through chemistry into the 70s. Well, so there is some advantages to these. For me, the favorite one was, living in the West Coast, good rain jackets. Still don't have a good one. So they did have some convenience for sure. The problem with them, and why they're called forever chemicals, is they're persistent. They last for generations, like DDT has as well. And so it is ubiquitous. But, there's so many chemicals that we're exposed to all the time. Some of them are not persistent, like organophosphate pesticides, for example, or bisphenol A or phthalates. So that's good. When we stop making them, they'll go away more quickly. But we're exposed to them every day. 90% of us are exposed to pyrethroids every day, almost 90% to organophosphate pesticides. The challenge, of course, with the PFAS chemicals, not only do they have many different toxic effects, thyroid disorders, certain cancers, early birth or premature birth, but they are persistent, and that makes it extraordinarily difficult to deal with.
How does a chemical like that get approved for use? What's the regulatory system like when someone comes up with a new chemical or something they want to put in a product?
Yeah, well, it's evolving, and it's continuing to evolve. As you might imagine, with at the time, over 70,000 chemicals, 80,000 chemicals, when we started to regulate them in North America, you couldn't do it overnight. And so many of them were grandfathered in. If they'd been used, you could continue to use them. Others had to go through new studies, oftentimes small studies in laboratories done by the industry themselves. And we'll talk about how that can lead to problems later on. Some of them are more rigorously evaluated, like pesticides. One of the things I find most striking, though, if you go back into the 1950s, there were two disasters, let's call them. One was Minamata Bay disaster, congenital mercury poisoning, which led to children being disfigured if they were exposed in utero. And that was from mercury from a plant that discharged it into the bay in a fishing village. A few years later, the thalidomide crisis. Pregnant women taking a drug that, if taken between 27th and 40th day after conception, led to seal limb, stunted limb development. Now, both of these really pointed out this idea that the developing fetus, the developing child, is uniquely vulnerable to toxic chemicals. Thalidomide, a drug, led to very rigorous regulations to protect us from unsafe drugs. The result of mercury poisoning certainly led to, ultimately, regulations. But if you compare the two, even though they're both chemicals, the weak regulatory standards for environmental chemicals is really quite striking. How little evidence we require before it's put on the market. Now, you could say, well, but you're actually taking this internally. But in some cases, the amount in your bloodstream from an environmental chemical is comparable with the amount that you get from taking a drug. So it's not just a matter of the dose that's distinct here.
In 1976, the EPA created the Toxic Substances Control Act in the US. You referred to the grandfathering. But as you say, there were so many chemicals by then that they said to the companies, if you got a bad one, you need to let us know so we can consider it or test it or whatever. It was sort of an honor system. How has that worked out?
Well, we have too many examples where it didn't work out well. And that means that we really should not trust industry-funded research if we want to err on the side of protecting the public. For example, with chlorpyrifos, an organophosphate pesticide that's just going to be phased out, banned in Canada this year, Leanne Shepard and some of her colleagues at the University of Washington went back and looked at the original 1972 study done by industry-funded scientists and found out that it was flawed, that if they'd used the right statistical method, they probably would not have been approved. Nobody went back and checked that until Leanne and her colleagues did just in the past few years. That somehow made it through all this regulatory process over the last several decades. Atrazine, which was made by Syngenta, now is clearly known as an endocrine disrupting chemical. They had contracted with Tyrone Hayes to do some studies to prove it was safe. He found it wasn't. He was going to release that. They began to attack him. So we've got so many examples like that. Paraquat now, which was just recently banned in Canada, it was shown that they had concealed evidence that paraquat causes Parkinson's, and that's only coming out because of lawsuits. So a lot of these things only come out long after the fact. And the same happened with PFAS. They had evidence that PFAS chemicals were toxic 3 decades ago, and it was never reported. So one of the key things we need to be clear about is that we cannot trust industry-funded research if we want to protect the public.
Why does it take so long from the point where we learn that a chemical is causing problems to the point where, like, 20 years or something it takes? Why does it take so long?
Well, I think one of the problems is once it's approved, however scanty the evidence is, it sort of has a seal of approval. Now the evidence required to overturn that is really quite challenging. Now contrast that with a drug trial. We have to have preclinical studies, phase 1, 2, 3 studies. We have to have placebo-controlled trials before a new drug is put on the market. That doesn't even begin to happen with environmental chemicals. Now, it raises some challenging questions. How could we, with more rigor, with more confidence, test these products before they're put on the market? Should we be doing challenge studies in humans? I'm not going to really sit here and propose that, but what I am going to suggest is if we don't do those kinds of studies, by default, what we're going to do is we're going to study this perhaps in laboratories, maybe in very small studies, and then we're going to put it on the market. And then we may spend the next 2 or 3 decades studying people after they've been exposed to these products, to these chemicals, to find out if it's toxic. Now, which one of those 2 scenarios sounds more unethical to you? But that's essentially what we're doing, is we're setting up these experiments that we're all part of, but nobody ever told us about it. Nobody ever asked us to sign a consent form saying, this is what we're doing, but that's what we are doing.
It sort of doesn't make sense. We have drugs that have to prove they're safe before they're allowed on the market. And we have chemicals that are used that get into our water and our food and everything else. And they're considered safe until proven dangerous.
Yes, it is challenging. And I think we almost have to go back 5 or 6 decades to find out, how did we get here in the first place? There were early on scientists who were very clear that they wanted to come up with a regulatory system that would protect us, that would make sure that no toxic products were put on the market. And I think what happened over a 5 or 10 year period, this has started out looking at contaminants in food, is they realized it would be really challenging, almost impossible. And so they came up with an assumption. And that assumption was that, you know what, at low levels, chemicals that don't cause cancer, so non-carcinogens, at low levels, they don't cause harm. They're safe. So that was a very convenient way to deal with it. And the real challenge here was, right, we had all this, the promise of technology, the promise of chemistry, better living through chemistry, right? And that not only had promise, but profits to be made, big profits to be made. And so there had to be a bargain struck. And what we came up with was this idea that there are acceptable levels. And that's what our regulatory system tries to deal with now, is this idea that there are, in fact, these acceptable levels. One of the questions is, well, acceptable to who? And this is one of the reasons, one of the most important reasons I think the public and parents need to get involved in these decisions, is that this should be a democratic decision. How much risk do we want to accept for our families in order for this company to continue to produce this product? That's something that we should all help to decide.
There's a lot of concern about the quality of the food that we eat. Can you talk about the chemicals that are used against weeds and insects that can damage crops? You know, farmers say they need to use this. So what are the risks of these chemicals and what are they?
Well, we can go back and we can go through a laundry list of what we found out in the past. For example, right now, well, let's talk about regrettable substitution. So back 3 generations.
Regrettable substitution?
Regrettable substitution. Well, it should sound a little bit more dark than that, but I mean, we can go back to my great-great-grandfather in Ottawa, Ontario, who was a beekeeper. He had 150 hives. And when he was 90, he was interviewed by the Beekeeper Association of Ontario. And he said his biggest problem was when they sprayed the orchard next door, right? That was very likely could have been lead arsenate. That was one of the early insecticides. Well, ultimately, whoops, that was a poison. We can't use that anymore. So we had DDT after the war. So that was lucky. We had DDT to use. Well, of course, that turned out to be a poison as well. No problem, no worries. We've got organophosphate pesticides. Now we've got scientists who are calling to ban all organophosphate pesticides, but don't worry, we've got pyrethroids and neonicotinoids. Now there is already some evidence of toxicity, but it hasn't yet made that threshold where we say we can't use these anymore. But there's a lot of reasons to be concerned. And yet we keep continuing on. There are some alternatives. And if you're paying attention to what's going on in agriculture, not so much industrial agriculture, but in some of the more innovative agriculture, regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, UNICEF in 2013 came out with this blanket statement, which I was just floored by. We don't need pesticides to feed the world, they said. Now, of course, most of us grew up believing that. Guess who started that? We don't need pesticides to feed the world. We may need to think about how we distribute wealth. We may need to think about how we grow food, but we don't need pesticides to feed the world. There are countries now who are committing to make sure that in 10 years, 30% of all agricultural lands are organic. There are countries that are proposing to go that route. We had no discussion of that when I was part of the Science Advisory Committee on the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. If we have all this evidence about pesticides, pesticides are in fact poisons, it's really only a question at what level. We have all this evidence, all this history. Shouldn't we begin to try to look to find alternatives? And this innovative agriculture, not only is it using other means than synthetic pesticides, it's also showing that using regenerative methods, you can actually sequester carbon and reduce problems with climate change. And yet there's not enough discussion about some of these alternatives.
We often hear that the residue, the pesticide residue that's on fruits and vegetables and grains is really very small and can just be washed away. Is that true?
Well, you could reduce some of those pesticides. I mean, residue makes it sound like it's almost inconsequential, doesn't it? You can reduce your exposure to those, but what's most effective is just, if possible, you choose organic. And there's been now at least a dozen studies with glyphosate, with organophosphates, with neonicotinoids, that when you shift to an organic diet, your pesticide levels in your urine drop almost immediately. So we know how to reduce those. And we know if we could provide incentives for farmers to shift to organic, then more would go that route. There's a premium to be made with organic. So when you have these residues, there was this, we're back to this idea of acceptable levels. All these residues, they're almost inconsequential. They're so small. Well, about 20 years ago, I was trained to believe that these small levels are inconsequential, that there's a threshold. Don't worry about those low levels of lead. They don't cause harm. That's the way I was trained. That's what I believed. And then we started to do research on lead and children's intellectual abilities. And we saw down to the lowest measurable levels, reductions in children's learning abilities. Not only did we see it down to the lowest measurable levels, beginning at the lowest levels, the decrements were actually steeper, greater. So the first 100 part per billion increase in blood lead was associated with a 6 to 7 IQ point drop. The second 100 part per billion increase, 1 or 2 IQ point drop. So there were greater deficits, decrements at the lowest measurable levels. So we saw that in one study, and then a second study, and then a third study, and I finally had to believe it. There were a total of 12 studies that looked at the same phenomena, mostly with intellectual abilities, mostly lead in blood, but some looked at it with lead in plasma, lead in bone. Some of them looked at academic abilities, and they saw the same pattern, these steep drop-offs in IQ scores, or a steep increased risk in school failures as beginning at the lowest measurable levels. So that was with lead. So I was primed, I was looking for this. We now know that it happens with air pollution. Particles below 2.5, airborne particles less than 2.5 microns in diameter, beginning at the lowest measurable levels, we see steep increases in the risk of death, beginning at the lowest measurable levels. Some of the research on that, most of the really outstanding research on that came from Canada. We also can see that with asbestos and mesothelioma, steep increases in the risk, benzene and leukemia, once again, begin at the lowest measurable levels. So this assumption that began 5 or 6 decades ago that there are safe levels hasn't played out for some of the most widely disseminated and well-studied toxic chemicals.
I've heard you say that 70% of women, pregnant women, have detectable levels of the herbicide glyphosate in their blood. So they're pregnant, and they've got this in their blood. What is that doing to the unborn child?
Well, we actually measure glyphosate in the urine. We typically measure the chemicals that are more persistent, or the metals we measure in blood. They tend to have a longer half-life, and so the blood's the better way to measure. For those chemicals that are less persistent, like organophosphate pesticides or phthalates or glyphosate, we measure those in the urine. So a study done, a MIREC study, did find that about 75% of women had detectable levels of glyphosate in their urine. We've only been able to measure glyphosate in human populations accurately, maybe for about 5 years, right? So this is 40 years after it was approved, right? So we're just beginning to look at human studies. So now we know that exposures aren't uncommon. Same studies done in Boise, Idaho that I was involved with. We found about the same, 70+% of pregnant women. So we now know exposures are common to glyphosate, as well as many of the other pesticides. And this was one of the questions I was trying to get at when I was the co-chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. We have this new study, just came out. How does that change the way you regulate something like glyphosate, right? Because the exposure is really important. Now, glyphosate's been used for over 3 or 4 decades. How did we come up with estimates of exposure? That's got to be part of the equation to understand whether there's really harm. Well, you come up with these models. You come up with these assumptions. Now we've got actual data. And I really wanted to know, how does that change the way we think about it? If there's no exposure, there's no risk. If there's exposure, there might be quite a bit of risk. Now, with glyphosate, the World Health Organization has said it's a probable human carcinogen. A meta-analysis completed just in the last few years. A meta-analysis is a synthesis of high-quality studies, a study of high-quality studies. They concluded from that meta-analysis that glyphosate is a causal risk factor for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And yet now we've got widespread exposure to glyphosate, not just in Canada, of course, around the world, because this is the #1 herbicide used around the world. 4 studies have found some suggestions that it leads to premature birth. There'll be a new study showing that it doesn't appear to be. It's not published yet. So there will be, and there always is, some differences in different studies. At what point do we say this is a problem? And I think this is, again, back to where we need to involve the public in these decision-making. If there is a hazard, a toxic chemical or a potential toxic chemical, do I want my government to be a little more vigilant, or do I want them to minimize new evidence? As somebody in public health who's seen these problems time and again, I think we should have health agencies, regulatory agencies that are watching out for these and really taking any new evidence seriously.
I want to get into your work on this Health Canada committee, but I first want to ask you, just following up on the fact that, you've done some work studying women and studying people who've been exposed. There's one study that you've been doing for a while, which basically got pregnant women and asked them if they would be tested and studied. And then once they had their children, you included their children in the study. Can you just talk a little bit about that? How many families now are you do you have in your study?
Yeah. So the first study we did like that, we call it the home study. And we recruited about 400 pregnant women and then their children, their families, the whole families really. And now the children are young adults. They're almost 20 and they've started college for the most part. And we've measured hundreds of chemicals in these kids, everything from pesticides and PFAS. One of the interesting things we found early on was the pregnant women had high levels of PFOA, one of those PFAS chemicals. And we didn't understand why. Well, what we found out is that it was because we lived 250 miles downriver from the plant, the PFOA plant that DuPont had. And that was where our drinking water came from, the Ohio River. One of the things we found is that PFOA appears to be an obesogen. Obesogen is a chemical that induces obesity, which is really kind of an interesting, troubling, but interesting concept, that it's not just how much you eat and how much you are active or physically active, but chemicals can modify your metabolism, can increase your chances of becoming obese. And now there's a number of those obesogens that have been identified, and PFOA is one of them. So we were really trying to say, how do we begin to understand, I started with lead, and this was sort of a second generation type study. The first generation studies, Herb Needleman studied lead in one cohort. Somebody else studied PCBs. Somebody else studied mercury. Well, the second generation studies were basically saying, well, now look, with this new technology, if we're going to go to all the expense of putting together a birth cohort of 400 pregnant women and collect blood and urine and hair and whatever else, then we should be efficient. So let's start measuring other chemicals at the same time. And what, of course, we all began to realize is that we're all a cocktail of these chemicals. We have, and when we talk about regulating these to make sure that they are not toxic, we're doing it one chemical at a time. And yet we know that sometimes if you have chemical A and chemical B, the toxic effects can be magnified. So looking at each of them separately won't give you the full picture.
Were you able to, or did you see any health effects on the mother or the child over time? You said they're around 20 years old now.
Yeah, we're still looking at them, but there's a few notable things that we found. PBDEs, it's a type of chemical flame retardant. We found higher levels of in utero exposure to PBDEs resulted in about 3 to 5 IQ point reduction in the offspring, those who had higher exposure, and an increase in ADHD type behaviors. Now that one's there's kind of a troubling backstory to this. Why are we using chemical flame retardants, chemicals that are intended to help reduce flammability of products? The reason is because cigarette smoking was so prevalent back in the 60s and 70s that a lot of people were dying from fires in beds. Well, how can we solve that? Well, the tobacco industry convinced us that the way to do it was to put these chemical flame retardants into products, into pajamas, into electrical equipment. The sad part of it is that they don't work very well, but we've all been exposed to these. All of us have these PBDEs in us now. So that was one of the key things that we found. Another one was what I mentioned with the PFOA and the increase in, we call it adiposity, or more obese children. We're continuing to follow and looking at brain scans to see how some of these chemicals may change either brain structure or how the brain functions. We found some evidence at very low levels with behavior problems with low-level lead exposure. With organophosphate pesticides, we saw that children were born about 3 days early. Now that brings in some interesting questions. 3 days early, right? So these are sometimes subtle effects. 3
Doesn't
days
sound
early,
like something would be a problem. 3 days?
not a problem at all, would it? Well, let's go back to those chemical cocktails. So if you're exposed to organophosphate pesticides, and on average that reduces the duration of pregnancy by 3 days, secondhand smoke plus 7 days, lead exposure plus 5 days, air pollution, let's add in another 3 days. If the family lived near highway traffic, now all of a sudden you've got all of these adding up in some women. And so it's the cumulative impact. 70% of the reasons that children are born preterm is unknown. But most of the time, people aren't looking at these chemical exposures. So it's the additive effect sometimes that can really be a problem.
I know that you were asked to serve on a committee and went and served on that committee. And I want you to tell me that story. But before that, how would you describe the regulatory system for herbicides and pesticides?
Well, in some ways, they've become more stringent over the years. There were protective factors, safety factors built in. In the 90s, after a study was done at the National Academy of Science, there was convincing enough evidence that children are particularly vulnerable to toxic chemicals like pesticides, and for a number of reasons. And so that led to extra safety factors being built into the models. So why are young children more vulnerable? Well, first of all, growing cells, fast-growing cells are more vulnerable to poisons. And this is exactly how chemotherapy works, chemotherapy for cancer patients. So when you give poisons, chemotherapy to patients with cancer, what you're really hoping for is that they get picked up by those fast-growing cells, the cancer cells. But what if those fast-growing cells are healthy brain cells that are growing during in utero development, those early brain cells? Well, that's a problem. The blood-brain barrier that protects the brain from certain chemicals isn't yet fully formed in the developing fetus. And so that can lead to additional vulnerabilities. In children, particularly toddlers, they put a lot of stuff in their mouths. That's just normal behavior. But if their house dust is poisoned, they're going to get more. And pound for pound, toddlers eat more, drink more, and breathe more than older children and adults. So if their air is contaminated, the food is contaminated, they're going to have a higher body burden, more of those chemicals. And that's exactly what we see. PBDEs, lead, cotinine, a metabolite of nicotine, certain pesticides we see are highest in young children. And so that puts them at particular risk. So there's some, we in some ways it's evolved. We've gotten better over the past 4 decades. But I think the key problem is some of the assumptions we made. There are safe levels, for example. And number 2, the way we've set it up so that the burden is on public health agencies to prove definitively, and it usually requires dozens of studies in humans and dozens of studies in animals before you say enough. We've got enough evidence. And I think that's the biggest issue. If we really were trying to protect the public, and that's what these agencies are set up for, right? They're not set up to protect the industry. They're set up to protect the public. And yet the way they operate too often is they are too little, too late.
So you were invited into the tent, as it were, at Health Canada to help them solve some of their regulatory issues. Tell us about that.
Well, I wouldn't say I was invited into the tent. I think I could peer through the canvas. So, I mean, initially, I should say that when I was asked if I wanted to do this, this is not something at least at my stage in my career, it's not something you get excited about, right? You know it's not going to be easy. You know it's going to be frustrating. You're going to spend lots of hours doing things you may not want to do, but you have an obligation. And so when I was asked if I'd be willing to be nominated, I said yes. When I was then invited to serve on the committee and to serve as a co-chair, again, I did it much out of obligation. But very early on, it became clear to me that it wasn't going to work. And the reason I didn't think it was going to work is because the terms of reference were so restrictive. In short, we couldn't ask questions. We could only answer questions asked of us. Now, I was a little excited initially because there seemed to be, and I think there was, an authentic desire for us to help them be more transparent. I have no question that they want to protect Canadians from toxic chemicals, from pesticides in this case. I have no doubt about that. I found the staff to be professional, to be competent, so I don't want to suggest anything other than that.
But
the problem is not the staff. The problem is the regulatory system itself that they are being asked to operate. And so it became clear, and I said very early on, around August of the summer I was invited to participate, that I didn't think I could participate because the terms of reference were so restrictive. We had a couple back and forth meetings, one-on-one meetings, to try to resolve that. And I was asked to trust that they would revise the terms of reference in a way that would be acceptable to me, and asked me to agree to serve for a year. And so I did agree. And the meetings didn't give me a lot of confidence. Number one, I assume we were still operating from the same terms of reference, even though we had never finally voted on them because they hadn't been finalized. But when I tried to get at questions like, how do you incorporate this new evidence that shows that 70+% of pregnant women, for example, in Canada, are exposed to glyphosate? How do you incorporate that into your models to make sure that you're protecting Canadians? I couldn't get an answer. Now, I don't know if there's legal constraints. I don't know if somebody higher up was saying, don't answer the question. I don't know why. I can only make assumptions. When we were asked to evaluate how pesticides were approved for use, several of us on the committee said, this is a great idea. Let's take something that's controversial. Let's take something where we have some evidence from human studies so we can really learn. How can you learn if you don't make mistakes, right?
The idea would be to learn what they missed when they were approving it.
That's right. Could we learn something so we don't do it again? But we were both discouraged, and ultimately, even though I asked that question at least 3 or 4 times, if you want to be transparent, help me understand, why did it take so long for you to ban chlorpyrifos, this organophosphate pesticide? And I say, why did it take so long? Back in 2003, there were 3 studies published at the same time, all showing consistent problems with exposure to chlorpyrifos or organophosphate pesticides in utero. Smaller head size, diminished IQs. Later on, we found evidence that it shortened the duration of pregnancy. Children were born a little smaller. So there was all this growing evidence, mounting evidence. And then by 2014, the US EPA was considering banning it, and they were moving towards that. That was under President Obama. In 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, for his inauguration ceremonies, this was fascinating and again quite troubling. He was given $1 million by from the CEO of the Dow Chemical Corporation, the same company that makes chlorpyrifos. And within a week, he had lifted that decision to ban chlorpyrifos. So how does this happen? Well, in very many ways, and sometimes very troubling ways. And don't forget, chlorpyrifos was the one where a reanalysis showed that the 1972 study that led to its approval was flawed, right? So we keep seeing these problems, and those kinds of things could be really important. We could learn from those. I don't know how much we could learn from about Donald Trump, but from some of the other things we could have learned from. How do we make sure that the original studies that were done 20, 30 years ago were done right, that the assumptions were adequate?
So what was the final straw for you? I mean, you're on this committee, you can't ask questions, but still you could contribute in some way. So what was the final straw?
There were two things. One is they did come back to me with a revised terms of reference. I think this was, let's say, mid-spring. And it really didn't change anything. They basically, there was, like half of a sentence added on that said, well, you can propose a question, and it would likely take 3 or 4 months. This is exactly what they told me. It'll likely take 3 or 4 months, and it might be approved. And
the question might be approved after 3 or 4 months.
Yes. So we're supposed to be independent. We're supposed to help them increase transparency. They had a transparency officer there to help us.
There's such a thing? A transparency officer?
We couldn't get simple questions answered. So that was part of it. The other half, I really struggled with this because, on one hand, I feel some obligation, but on another hand, I was quite troubled that my presence on this committee was giving the impression that I had confidence in what was going on and that others should too. And by this time, I had no confidence. I lost confidence. Now, that's not to say, we're better than we would have if we had no regulatory system. The regulatory system that they're operating from, they are adhering to, but it's failing to protect citizens. And the simplest way I can get that across, I think, is to say over the past 20 years, when this system was operating, we've seen problems with atrazine. We've seen problems with chlorpyrifos, the ones we've already talked about. We've seen problems with paraquat. Now, if the system was perfect, of course, none of that would happen. We shouldn't probably expect perfection. But the amount of time it takes to regulate these from when the problems, hazards, toxicities first identified, it's 20 years in some cases. Sometimes it's much longer. If we go back to lead, in 1925, Yandell Henderson, who was a physiologist from Yale, said, don't put lead in gasoline. It will cause a scourge worse than tuberculosis, with hardening of the arteries, he said. That was 100 years ago. And not only did we put it in gasoline, but up until very, very recently, we failed to even recognize it as a leading cause of coronary heart disease, even though 100 years ago, somebody warned us about it. Actually, William Osler, one of the most influential physicians from Canada, like ever, said in 1912 that arteriosclerosis, first of all, was rare in hospitals. But we know that chronic lead intoxication is a risk factor for this, right? So we've had all this evidence, and now we've had this century, a pandemic of lead poisoning that has cost, I don't know how many hundreds of trillions of dollars. And who's paying? Who pays for that?
I'm going to turn to the audience now and let them ask some questions. Angie, can we have the first question?
The first question is from Meg. Meg asks if you could please comment on the types of harms, in addition to causing cancer, that should be acted upon by regulators. when first detected. For example, endocrine disrupting or hormone mimicking chemicals are still not considered toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act.
Yeah, the endocrine disrupting chemicals is a really big one, in part because we have good evidence that, again, there's no safe level, and in some cases at the lowest measurable level that aren't always looked at, you can see harm. We know that some hormones act in the parts per trillion. So most of the chemicals we're measuring today, we focus on parts per billion. And so both because of the mode of action at extraordinarily low concentrations, we need to be worried about these endocrine disrupting chemicals. And because of the widespread function of these of the endocrine system, and it communicates throughout the body. So thyroid disorders, of course, is a big one that we've looked at because we're worried about children's development. And the developing child doesn't produce their own thyroid hormone until later in pregnancy and during the first year of life. And so they're completely reliant on the mother's thyroid. We know that if you change the sex steroid balance in utero, that it changes the makeup of the reproductive tract. So, for example, there was this syndrome in rodents, rats and mice, called phthalate syndrome. Phthalate's that chemical that's used in plastics to make plastics softer. And they found in these rodent studies that if they were exposed to higher levels of phthalates, phthalates are anti-androgenic, they lower testosterone. That absolutely, no question about this, they lower testosterone. The little boy rats look more like little girl rats. That is, the distance between the scrotum and the anus is smaller, like little girls. And if you look at that, there's been now 4 studies in human boys that found the same pattern. And what happened? Regrettable substitution. So that was shown with one type of phthalate that slowly was taken off the market, was replaced with another phthalate that was found in the same pattern. So the endocrine disrupting chemicals are extraordinarily important because of how the hormones communicate throughout the body, and because things can happen at the very lowest levels of exposure. And the challenge of the regulatory agencies to address things like these extraordinarily low doses, like endocrine disrupting chemicals, chemical cocktails, these are some of the real big challenges, which should lead us to find ways to reduce chemicals in the first place, even before we know they're toxic, or even before we suspect that they're toxic. We should assume, just like with drugs, that they have the potential to be toxic. And how do we protect the public? First and foremost, you try to reduce the amount out in the environment.
So is this regrettable substitution the way that industry keeps their chemicals on the market? They just tweak them a little bit and then they're good to go again?
Absolutely. That's one way they do it. And that's why there's been a growing call to regulate classes of chemicals, not one chemical at a time.
The next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Gloria. And Gloria asks, would the 25% who didn't have glyphosate in urine eat an organic diet?
We didn't have, Gloria, we didn't have enough good information. I can tell you about another study that was not done in Canada, but it might shed some light on what we found. This was a study done around Boise, Idaho, and we followed, it was a small study, 40 pregnant women, but we followed them over the entire latter part of the pregnancy for about 2/3 or more of the pregnancy. And we collected urine every week from them. And then within that study, within that observational study, we had a 2-week randomized study of organic diets. And sorry, I lost my ear. We had a randomized study of organic diets. And what we wanted to see is what happens to glyphosate. And we saw about a 25% reduction in glyphosate, a significant reduction in glyphosate in the urine of women when they switched over to an organic diet, but only if the women didn't live near an agricultural field. If they live near an agricultural field, we did not see a significant drop. It dropped a little, but not significantly. Now, the fact that it only dropped by about 25% in the women who live far away from the field suggests that there are other sources. Now, they may not have had a complete switch over to organic diet, so there's other possibilities, but it suggests that exposure is quite widespread. So the organic diet can help reduce your exposure. It probably won't do everything.
The next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Richard. Richard asks, says, Bruce, I really like the way you speak as it resonates with my thinking. Meg Sears and I have been proposing for some years that there ought to be an institute that facilitates linking environmental exposures to adverse health outcomes. The major hurdle is funding for this. Do you have any ideas?
I think it has a lot of merit. I think there's a number of things that we need to put in place, and I think that fits into it. Surveillance for environmentally induced disease. There's this great story out of London where, great story, meaning powerful story, even though it's tragic at the same time. A 9-year-old girl named Ella died with asthma. And so on her death certificate, it was written, what did she die of? Asthma. Well, the mother wasn't going to put up with this. She knew that her daughter died because of the air pollution. Now, that never makes it onto the death certificate. But after 6 years, she finally convinced them that they had to put air pollution on as a contributing cause. Now, think about that. What if we started to put down not what people die of, heart disease, malignant mesothelioma, COPD, but what they died from, the upstream risk factors. One of the things that I've realized over the past 25 years, and I'm both public health physician, but also intensely interested in history, is if you go back and look at why are we dying, the origin of chronic disease, and you begin to realize that what we're dying from, these are all man-made problems. You know, there's a lot of focus on genetics. That sort of distracts us from knowing that these are man-made problems. All of the money that we put towards genetics is really not getting us where we want to go. But if we started to focus on these upstream risk factors and looked at why do we have coronary heart disease? Why are people dying from heart disease all the time? This is a rare disease 120 years ago. But you can begin to see with the advent of smoking, air pollution, the addition of lead to air pollution, to cars, gasoline, that's where you saw this big peak in the coronary heart disease epidemic. Now, coronary heart disease deaths have actually declined by 70% since the peak in the 60s, which is wonderful, but nobody really knows why. But if you go back and you start to map it out, it's very clear that the epidemic is primarily being driven by heavy metals and air pollution, or heavy metals in air pollution. That includes tobacco smoke. The metals, we now know, create tears on the inside of the arteries. So anyway, all of that's to say, we need better surveillance. We need death certificates that try to get at what were the upstream risk factors. And why that's so important is once we identify the upstream risk factors, we can prevent disease. Now, wouldn't that be novel? To focus on preventing disease. We do pretty well with that with infectious disease, with vaccines. Outside of that, the emphasis on what's the next new profitable drug. Back in the 1970s, there was a lot of excitement as the rates of coronary heart disease were coming down. Public health leaders were saying, this is great. Maybe we can begin to end this dreaded disease, this dreaded killer. They even use that term. How many times do you hear somebody from a public health agency talk like that anymore? They were excited about prevention. When outside of infectious disease, have you heard people talk about prevention, except when they say, oh, this is because of your lifestyle choice? No. Much of the disease, much of the death today is from environmental causes, things that we can't control without the help of our government. So the other thing I would say we need is a Canadian Institute for Health Research in Environmental Hazards. We don't have one. When CIHR was established about 20 years ago, they decided that was too controversial. I'm sure there was an industry representative somewhere in there who made that argument. But how can you, in today's age, when so much of death, disease, and disability is because we live in an industrialized society, how can you not have an institute that focuses on environmental hazards? So I think there's a number of things that we need to have in place, and certainly surveillance for environmentally induced disease is a part of that.
So maybe some philanthropist will step forward and instead of just giving it to a hospital, give it to an institute.
Well, that would be useful, but this really should be funded by the government. It does bring up another point, though, and maybe this is a narrative that I thought was really quite powerful. I worked with some colleagues down at the University of California, San Francisco, who are doing research on childhood leukemia, and they had found that about 1 in 4 children who developed childhood leukemia, developed leukemia because of exposures to either highway traffic, paints and solvents, pesticides, or smoking, particularly by the father in utero. 1 in 4 cases of childhood leukemia. If you step back and try to look at where our health dollars go, 96% go to treatment, 4% towards prevention. Based at the National Institute of Health, I don't have data from CIHR, for their budget focused on childhood cancer, 1% goes to prevention. All right, so I did an interesting survey I want to share with you. One is at about 10 different, this is about 3-4 years ago, at 10 different meetings where I did a talk, including 250 pediatricians at the Canadian Pediatric Society in Vancouver. I asked a question of the pediatricians. How many of you would vote to increase funding to enhance the cure for childhood leukemia, which is arguably the poster child for finding a cure for cancer, or increase funding to find ways to prevent childhood leukemia? Right now, these are pediatricians, don't forget. Out of the 1,000 pediatricians at 10 different venues, there was very little inconsistency. They all said about the same thing. And it was actually quite hopeful. Out of the 1,000 plus pediatricians, 5, a half of 1%, voted to increase funding to find ways to enhance the cure for childhood leukemia. Virtually all of them voted to increase funding to find ways to prevent childhood leukemia. But only 1% of research dollars goes to find ways to prevent childhood leukemia. We don't know what parents would say. My guess is if you ask them, they would say the same thing the pediatricians did. That's not a fair question to ask for a parent who already has a child with leukemia, but I bet if you ask them, do they wish that their government had funded research to prevent childhood leukemia 20 years ago? They'd say yes. So why is it that our health system, even in Canada where we have universal health care, are so focused on finding a cure and so disinterested in preventing chronic disease?
So clearly there's a need for that. Next question.
Yeah, the next question for Bruce. You said that even though Canada, the US, and Europe banned many uses of lead, the North American and European corporations using lead in their products have shifted sales of lead containing products to the global south. Is there anything that Canada and the United States should be doing to help end this practice?
Well, yes, absolutely. I think treaties, for example, 50 years after the Minamata disease disaster, there was an international treaty. You know, it's not perfect and everything else, but it's moving in that direction. So treaties are a big one where you try to reduce the use of chemicals. But we also, need to be very careful here, because up until 2012, Canada exported asbestos, a known carcinogen, suspected at least as early as the 1930s, and certainly by the 1970s was unquestionably a carcinogen. And yet Canada was exporting it. Canada was giving out federal loans for the asbestos industry. So certainly we should not be involved in any practice like that. I think we also need to take seriously the in our own home how we deal with fossil fuel industries, right? Those are at the root of a lot of the chronic diseases we're talking about. And you know, I don't. Nobody's ever quantified it to say how many deaths would be averted if we shifted over completely from fossil fuels, but it's not inconsequential. So I think, yes, there are some things we can do. I think for the most part, and I think it's because of maybe being politically correct and not wanting to get in the crosshairs of industry, which I understand, but we play it safe. You know, let's provide vaccines to kids, but let's not get involved in things about leaded gasoline. So I think we play it safe and at the expense of public health, whether that's, again, domestic problems or international problems. So I think we need some leaders with courage. How about that?
Okay, and the next question?
Yeah, another question from an attendee. If the best alternative to protecting the public from pesticides used in agriculture is shifting to organic production, can that be a real solution unless we address the economic inequality in Canada that currently means only a minority of Canadians can afford the more expensive organic food?
You're absolutely right. There was, I was doing a talk like this down in Wisconsin, and somebody said, well, if you had one wish, what would you do? And I said, legislate a living wage for everybody. Now that's not going to solve all the problems, but it would solve many. And part of it would be that, now this was in the United States, so it's even worse there, but it's still a challenge here for sure. It would give people the ability to work one job, to worry about other things like what they're eating. And so I think that would be the number one thing. We absolutely do need to find ways to reduce the growing wealth inequality, which is just gross when you look at it. That has to be a big part of anything we do. And, you know, we're talking about toxic chemicals today, but, you know, even if we solve the toxic chemical problem of the world, there'll be other ones. It's a big one, I think, in large part because we've ignored it for so long. And when you ignore these things under the surface, at some point they become a disaster, like, you know, the lead pandemic and what we're still cleaning up 100 years later. But we've got to deal with these other social issues as well, for sure.
Okay, Angie, and the next question?
Sorry, just 1 second. I'm trying to, you point out that regulation of toxic chemicals is based on the premise that there are safe levels of exposure, when, as you pointed out, we now know the premise is largely false. But every Occupational Health and Safety Act in Canada says that there are safe levels of toxic chemicals to which workers can be exposed. What should we be doing to change that?
Yeah, it's, you know, we're sort of running into the same problem we did, is that once something's approved for use, the evidence required to overturn that becomes, you know, extraordinarily challenging. And that's true for the assumptions we make, the beliefs that we have, even in science. We like to think, well, we're scientific and therefore, you know, we don't believe things, but it really is challenging. And even a close friend who's no longer with us, who does work in this area, I said to him, you know, I'd like you to comment on this new study I have, commentary showing all of the evidence about lead and radon and asbestos and air pollution, that there's harms at the very lowest levels. And he'd seen this firsthand with air pollutants, but he says, but, you know, extraordinary evidence is needed to overturn this. But when you step back and look at the evidence that was available to people when that assumption was made, that assumption that there are safe levels, there was no evidence. And so even when there is no evidence, overturning that belief is extraordinarily difficult. I think the other problem, and I think this led up to this idea of acceptable levels as well, is that it's overwhelming to think about. Right, we talked about 1 out of 3 kids today is still lead poisoned. That is, they have a blood lead over 50 parts per billion. It's overwhelming to think about how we're going to fix that problem. It's overwhelming to think about how we're going to deal with fossil fuel crisis that we're in the midst of. And so we come up with these sort of, well, number one, we don't acknowledge it. And we come up with these incremental changes to try to monkey with it, but we don't really resolve the problem. It's going to take bold leadership to address some of these problems we've talked about. But I think if we gave ourselves a window of 10 or 20 years, and occasionally we talk about this, by 2050, we're going to be completely reliant on renewable energy in Vancouver. We should be doing that for pesticides and toxic chemicals, even perhaps before they're found to be toxic.
We don't actually even have a Clean Air Act that would protect us from the chemicals in the air. We don't have a Clean Water Act. If we haven't even started with those basics, how are we going to get to all these other things like the pesticides? Right.
So we have guidance. We don't have enforceable standards, but we have guidance. And, to give credit to Health Canada where it's due, we have one of the lowest guidance levels for lead and water. That doesn't mean the problem is gone. It's 5 parts per billion. We still have to carry it out. And so, absolutely, should we be creating enforceable standards instead of guidance? Yes. With air pollution, the existing guidance level is 10 microgram per cubic meter averaged over 3 years. It's hard to compare it directly because other times it's like over 3 months in the US. That was probably adequate 10 years ago, but in 2021, the World Health Organization said you shouldn't be exposed to levels above 5. So right now, about 85% or so of Canadians are exposed to levels above 5. And we already know that 5's not completely protective. We know that there are effects below 5. There are no safe levels. We know that for air pollution. So what would that look like? I think that would be, what if we had a 20-year strategy to bring air lead levels down, airborne particles down such and such, maybe it's to 2.5 in 20 or 25 years. Those are the kinds of bold initiatives I think we really need if we're going to take this idea seriously that we're protecting the health of the public from environmental hazards.
Yeah, it would certainly be a start. Do we have another question?
Yep. The next question, somebody asked, could you speak of the problem in Canada that many of the federal departments like Health Canada and Agriculture Canada, responsible for protecting Canadians, also see their role as promoting the Canadian industries in their sectors? Isn't this a conflict of interest?
Absolutely. That's all I got to say. Absolutely. I mean, you can't if you have an agency that has a goal, a mission to protect the health of the public, you should not have industry representatives serving on that committee or that council. Given the history of what we've seen with how the industry has misrepresented the science, has represented their own interests, and we shouldn't be surprised that they represent their own interests. Many of us do as well. But we've given them too much power, too much lobbying. I don't have figures for Canada, but back in 2016, when Tosca was being modernized in the United States, the chemical industry spent over $60 million lobbying its politicians, lobbying Congress, $60 million. They still spend $30 to $40 million a year now. Lobbying should be banned. We should not have industry representatives serve on advisory councils or committees. That, at a minimum, that should just not even be a question if we truly want to protect the health of the public.
Okay, we've got several questions. We'll see if we can try and get through them all. Angie?
Yeah, the next question is from Meg. You have tremendous knowledge about pesticides. Right now, there are many new potentially harmful pesticides being introduced while old ones are very slowly phased out. How can chemicals laws be changed to stem these increases in chemicals in commerce?
It's a great question. I don't know how it's going to happen, Meg, unless we have more stringent requirements in the first place. And I think those have to be, let's say, more akin or more analogous to how we regulate drugs. We have to assume they're going to be toxic. We have to test them more rigorously. It may not be enough to test them in laboratory animals. So what does that mean? How do we begin to really thoroughly test something that's going to expose humans if we don't study it in humans? Now, we could say that if you can't convince enough humans to participate in those types of pesticide challenge studies, maybe it's not an important enough chemical to introduce. I think the more important question is, even before we get to that point, is our Health Canada, at least, if not the regulatory agency, should be asking whether we even need these chemicals in the first place. And how do we promote chemical-free processes, whether that's in the food industry or in the agriculture industry. So that's not a great response, Meg. Be happy to spend time with you, because I don't know that I know I don't have the answers myself. It's a really challenging problem.
Okay, we'll go to the next question now.
Yeah, the next question. Could you comment on another aspect that has caused unnecessary harm to the public? The role of industry-funded scientists in downplaying or misrepresenting harm in the studies they do. I'm told there are some good books exposing this role of industry-sponsored funded scientists. Could you also direct us to any of these?
Yes, two of them by a good friend, David Michaels. I think, was it Merchants of Doubt? There's a couple of them. And then
Manufacturing Doubt.
Thank you. Yeah, we talked about this the other day, and he's just come out with a new one, which is Triumph of Doubt, I believe. So that's a good place to start. There's so many of these stories. In fact, one of the main reasons I ended up immigrating to Canada is because I kept getting kicked off of science committees. Because under President George W. Bush, the lead industry was so powerful, they were able to get me kicked off the CDC lead poisoning prevention advisory committee. I was serving on the Commission for Environmental Cooperation in Montreal. We got to report directly to the ministers of environment in Mexico, the United States, and Canada. But as soon as President Bush's designee was put in place as the director, he got rid of the expert panel on children's environmental health and quashed the report that we had coming out on children and pollution. So there's so many stories about this, which makes you wonder, how can we continue to allow industry to play such a powerful role? But they do it quite well. I mean, they hire great advertising agencies, and they figured out how to use the playbook, and I guess our health agencies haven't figured out how to counter it.
Yeah, those two books by David Michaels will open your eyes on this issue.
Yeah.
Angie, the next question?
Yeah, the next question from Richard. Richard asks, how do we get rid of industry influence on the PMRA?
The PMRA,
well, I think
just tell.
Pest Management Regulatory Agency, so the agency that regulates pesticides and other pest products. I think, before I said that my sense was the staff at PMRA are professional, they're very respectful, very competent. I think it's going to have to be changing the legislation and mandate. Maybe this is a good chance, because I always intend to say this, and sometimes I forget. In some ways, of course, we're holding the agencies accountable, we're criticizing the agencies. In the end, I want to I want to support the agency so much. I want to give them a stronger mandate. I want to give them more resources. I want to double the amount of resources they have, because what they do is so important. And we can't accomplish what we need to accomplish unless they have that mandate. And unless they get these industry representatives off their advisory councils. Now, the Science Advisory Committee that I served on, I was the co-chair, we did not. So in that sense, we were independent. We were independent, but impotent.
Okay, the next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Miriam. And Miriam asks, how can we be effective on the political front to expose the severe limitations of the current regulatory system? Should we be pushing for the precautionary principle combined with the substitution principle and rally the broader environment movement to push politicians to incorporate these combined principles as foundational to decision-making regarding the licensing and continuing use of chemical pesticides and herbicides?
Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah, I think I can see the core of it. You know, the precautionary principle has been around for what, 20 plus years. And the industry did a pretty good job of pushing back on it. But the basic principle is exactly what we need, whatever we call it. I think it's going to take. So here's what I learned after being in Canada for a year. So we've been here now 15 years. I can tell you, I kind of got railroaded out by the lead industry in part, but there were other things too. I wanted to be in Canada. But after about a year living in Canada, I realized that one of the biggest problems, the underlying problems in the United States, is it's being run like a corporation by the mega corporations. If you carry that analogy out, you've got the majority shareholders, the very wealthy and the mega corporations, and you've got the minority shareholders. That's citizens, each of us. The only way we're going to trump, sorry for the term, we're going to outvote the majority shareholders is if all of us get together, the scientists, the advocates, the parents, the general public, and say enough. It's going to take a collective effort. And of course, we've got to bring the political leaders in and maybe speak to them as parents, right? But I don't think it's going to happen until we find a way to get together and demand it. But having said that, I am quite optimistic. I think, you know, this is something my dad told me. My dad had ALS, and that was the other reason we moved up to Canada. He lived in Seattle, so it was a very close drive. And I remember just belly aching and bitching about Congress and inequities and so on. And he was in his power chair, completely paralyzed, and just listening. And after about 15 minutes, he says, you know, I've got a lot of optimism about the United States. I said, really? He said, yes, in 100 years, I'm sure we'll be in a better place. And in 100 years, I think we'll look back on this time, just like we look back on the time when people lived in tenement housing, where they were dumping their crap into the water and they were drinking sewage in their water. We look back on that, we go, how could they do that? And we're going to look back on this time and say the same thing about chemicals and pollutants. How could they do that? The question for me isn't whether we'll get there. The question is, how quickly can we get there? And what I hope is that I can contribute to accelerating that transition.
Okay. The next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Allison. And Allison asks, is ending fossil fuel and petrochemicals subsidies a solution, and switching it over to organic and regenerative agriculture, as well as a truly livable basic income guarantee? And how do we get these passed by government? As well, isn't lead an issue in a percentage of water distribution pipes in cities in Canada still today?
I'll start with the easy one. Yes, lead is still a problem in pipes. And I was just watching a webinar that asbestos can be a problem in water pipes as well. So we've got to take these infrastructure issues very seriously. We've got to start if we're concerned about our health, we've got to start with the water and the air and the food we eat. We all want good medical care when we're sick, towards the end of our life, absolutely, and we all deserve it. But we've got to start with water, food, air, if we're truly serious about staying healthy. You brought up the social inequities again. Absolutely, that's a part of it, and that's not maybe quite as basic as I need food and water, but it's close. So we've got to deal with those issues. How are we going to get there? Once again, I think it's just going to have to be that we finally say enough, and let's get together, from all walks of life, and say that people deserve the right to a healthy environment. People deserve a living wage, and those are just basic human rights.
And this might be close to our last question, Angie.
Yeah, the next question, Allison also asks, what about the industrial waste chemicals used in fluoridation?
Yeah, well, this is probably one of the more contentious areas that I've studied, and you can imagine I've been involved in a couple areas like that. What we're referring to is that there are fluoride in waste products, like from fertilizer, for example. And if it were discarded, it would have to be treated as a toxic waste. But in some cases, it's used and put in municipal water supplies as fluoridation to prevent tooth decay. Fluoride in water is very contentious. We did a study again with the MIREC cohort. We had measures of urinary fluoride in mom's urine from each trimester, and we looked to see whether it had an impact on children's intellectual abilities at 3 to 4 years of age. And we saw that it did, especially boys, that higher amounts of fluoride in mom's urine, the boys did more poorly on IQ tests. We saw that they did even worse if the mom had lower iodine, which would suggest, and then finally we found some evidence that women who were exposed to fluoridated water were more likely to have hypothyroidism, low thyroid. As I mentioned before, thyroid's really critical for the developing brain because the fetus doesn't produce their own yet. And so what this all suggests is that during fetal development, fluoride might be a neurotoxicant. So we know at high levels fluoride is toxic. There's evidence down to even levels where fluoride is in the water. But this is such a contentious area to deal with, and people's beliefs are so strong. Finally, what we, as scientists, recommended, because we were told by the dental experts that the developing fetus and infants, before they have teeth, before their teeth erupt, they get no benefit from fluoride. That was the group that we saw evidence of harm with. And so we suggested that pregnant women avoid fluoridated water, black tea hyperaccumulates fluoride, and that they don't use tap water if they're going to formula feed their infant. Right? We didn't say anything about fluoridated water, but of course, boy, we're re-attacked. It's a really contentious area to deal with.
I think that's the end of the questions. I just have one final question for you, Bruce. There's been you talked about it, and a lot of questions about the regulatory environment that we live in. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act was recently updated. Do you see anything positive out of the changes that were made?
I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. My understanding is that a lot of what's going to happen over the next 2 years will determine what it looks like. If that's true, I'm hopeful that maybe there's a window of opportunity for us to at least begin to demand that it's more protective, that the standards are in place, that we have access to this data. This type of data, like when the school in Seattle had to deal with lead and water as a problem, they put up weekly reports of what levels they were finding in the water fountains, in the sinks, online. This type of information should be available to people. We can, put some privacy protections in place for sure, but this type of information is critical for health. And you can't have a good public health system without good surveillance, without good measurements of what the exposures are. And this should be publicly available. So those should be taken into account, those kinds of things. And of course, again, there's many other things that I can't even begin to address here. But there's an opportunity for groups of people to get together and say, this is what we've learned from past mistakes. This is what we need to do going forward.
I guess that's a good note to end on. I want to bring Jim Turk back for some closing remarks.
Well, I just want to thank the two of you for a really engaging session. I mean, Sandra, you modeled what a good journalist does when they're asking questions. It was quite impressive. And Bruce, I could listen to you for hours. You're so articulate and you get to the nub of crucial issues. So thank you both very much for absolutely wonderful conversation. A video of this conversation will be uploaded to the CFE website and our YouTube channel tomorrow. As well, we will post a list of resources for those of you who got interested in some of the issues that Bruce and Sandra were talking about and some of the references that were made, so you can follow up and explore this more. The CFE website is CFE for Center for Free Expression, cfe.torontomu.ca. Our next event will be 2 weeks from today. That's Tuesday, October 24th at 4 p.m. on a very different subject. It's going to be, the title is Exploring Systemic Islamophobia in Canada. So I'd invite you to that. If you want more information about our upcoming events, our many past events that are all available on our website and our YouTube channel, go to our website, cfe.torontomu.ca. Thank you all very much to both of you and to the audience for joining us today. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.